So thank you for sticking it out for the last talk of the day. I will try to keep you entertained so that you don't fall asleep. Yes, and I think that I have actually a very nice topic for this because it's something that we can all relate to, which is social behavior. So we, as humans, are a highly social species. We interact with other members of our species every day, and we really depend on each other for our very survival. But we, of course, are not alone in being so social. When we look across nature, we see that social living and group living is something that's widespread in nature and has evolved multiple times across many different taxa. So why can it be beneficial to live in groups? There are a number of reasons. It might be beneficial to use information that other members of your group have about the location of resources, for example, food. It can be useful to detect and avoid predators. And it can also be useful to integrate information to make better collective decisions together. But in order to reap these benefits of group living, social groups have to coordinate with one another. And they have to do so in a wide variety of different contexts. For example, many animal groups move around together throughout the day, meaning that they have to have some mechanism for staying together and maintaining cohesion. They also have to make collective decisions about when and where they're going to move. And in many instances, animal groups need to join forces to cooperate, for example, to defend themselves against predators or competitors. And underlying all forms of coordination is some form of communication. And in many cases, this communication takes the form of vocal communication. So this is the focus of our research in the Communication and Coordination Across Scales project. We're trying to answer the question, how do animal groups coordinate with one another? And what role does vocal communication play in mediating this coordination? So to do this, we've brought together an interdisciplinary and international team. I want to point out especially these four people who are the co-PIs on the grant, Marta, Marie, Kay, and Ben, who are all here today. So if you have any tricky questions at the end of the talk, you should definitely direct that to them. And we are studying this topic across 3 species of social mammals that we see as kind of a test bed of different types of coordination because they range from highly cohesive meerkat groups through to widely dispersed hyena clans. And I'll be introducing you to these animals in a moment. And what we're doing is we're applying common methodologies across these 3 different species to look at communication and coordination. So in particular, we are using small tags known as biologging tags, which contain sensors such as a GPS and microphones, as well as accelerometers, which we can put on the animals and put them on all members of a social group. And then that allows us to get data on where all the members of a group are at any moment in time, and also all the ways that they're behaving and talking to it or vocalizing to each other. And we're combining this with direct observation in the field and field experiments, as well as doing this in the context of long-term studies that allow us to have some long-term contextual information about these groups. For example, who's dominant to who, who's related to who, and also their social relationships with one another. So today I just want to tell you 3 kind of short stories about communication and coordination in animal societies, staying together, splitting up, and then coming back together. And we're actually studying these contexts of coordination across multiple species, but today I'm just going to talk about 1 species per context and also use it as a way to introduce you to our 3 different study species. So let's start with staying together and deciding where to go. And this brings us to the meerkats. So meerkats are a social mongoose species. They live in stable social groups that have a dominant male and female that basically monopolize most of the breeding, and a bunch of subordinates that help to rear the offspring. And these groups travel around together throughout their territory during the day, digging in the ground for prey. And they can travel over a couple of kilometers, always staying together as a cohesive group. And to do this, they use a lot of vocalizations that are known to be associated with the coordination of movement. So some questions that we are interested in understanding in this system are, how are these groups deciding where and when to move? And who has control over these group decisions? Are there certain individuals that are wielding outsized influence over where the groups go? So to address this, we put together some of these biologging collars that I was mentioning earlier. These have a GPS, which can record their location every second. They also have an accelerometer, which tells us something about the behavior. And they also have an audio recorder, which can monitor the vocalizations. So we put these tags on entire groups of meerkats at the Kalahari Meerkat Project in South Africa. And from these collars, we get things like audio data, which we then use machine learning and have developed some machine learning tools to be able to extract and classify calls from this data. And then integrating this together with the movement data, we get a picture like this. So this is a visualization of some of our data. This is a group of 7 meerkats. Each marker represents an individual meerkat, and the little colors that are coming up within the markers represent all the vocalizations that the meerkats are giving. So you can see they're really, really vocal. They basically never shut up, and they're always talking back and forth to each other and using these vocalizations to coordinate movement. So there's really a lot going on here, and we're still digging into this data a lot, but I just want to show you one thing, which is about how they decide where to go. And so when we want to think about who has influence over group direction, we might start by looking at who initiates group turns. So basically, if an individual starts moving to the right, what's the probability that the group is going to follow by also moving to the right? So in this plot, I'm going to show you on the x-axis an individual's left-right movement, at one moment in time, and then at a later moment in time, what's the probability that the group turns right? So empirically, if we do this with from our data, for each individual, we can make a curve that looks something like this. It's kind of a sigmoidal shape, so the more an individual is moving to the right, the more likely it is that the group is going to move to the right sometime later, and the same thing for moving to the left. But interestingly, if we make these curves for different individuals in the group, they have different shapes. So we might get a curve for some individuals that looks like this, which are relatively flat. So this indicates that it's kind of like low influence. No matter how much I'm moving to the right, it doesn't really seem to affect the group very much. On the other hand, we might have curves that are much more steep, which would indicate high influence over group decision making. So this is an example of some curves that we fit to our data for one of our groups that we tracked. And one thing that probably jumps out to you immediately is this red curve right here, which is the most steep one. That happens to be the group's dominant female. And actually, if we do this across multiple groups, we find that this is a recurring pattern, that in general, dominant females seem to have the greatest influence over the group direction. But what about vocalizations? And can individuals use vocalizations to modulate their influence? So for this, we looked at a particular vocalization known as a move call. I'll play you one here. Did it play? Yeah, I think it heard. So basically, these are calls that are associated with the group, getting the group moving and getting the group to basically like speed up. But we wanted to know whether these calls can also be used to turn the group and increase an individual's influence over group direction. So to answer this question, we looked at basically these same types of curves, but we subsetted our data to instances when the individual was either not giving these move calls or was giving these move calls. And so what you can see is that on the left plot, when they were not giving move calls, this is what the curves look like. And then on the right plot, when they were giving the move calls, this is what the curves look like. So basically, the curves get much steeper when they are giving these move calls, indicating that move calls are a way that individuals are kind of temporarily increasing their influence over the group direction. So now that we talked about cohesive movement, I actually want to talk about cases where groups split up. So for this, we turn to our second study species, the white-nosed coatis. So white-nosed coatis are similar to meerkats in the sense that they travel around together throughout the day, and they also are foraging on scattered prey throughout the landscape, although they also forage on fruit, which is a much more clumped resource, meaning that there's a bit more competition within the group potentially. And groups are also having a different social structure to meerkats. They're composed of unrelated females and their offspring. And so we basically did a similar tracking study on these coati groups, tracking whole groups of coatis in Panama. And this is some of the GPS data that we got back. And you'll notice something immediately that's different from the meerkats, which is that these groups actually split up. So they split into subgroups, and then later they will merge together. And this happens quite frequently. So basically, the coatis are showing what's known as fission-fusion dynamics, where subgroup membership is dynamic and changing over time. So what drives these fission-fusion dynamics? In particular, what determines who is splitting into a subgroup with who else? One idea that we had is that maybe it has to do with something about physical constraints. So for example, if you have a group where there are some individuals that are inherently faster than other individuals that are inherently slower, you might imagine if the group is moving along together, you would naturally get a kind of separation into a slow group and a fast group. This doesn't turn out to be what we think is happening in our data. What we found instead is that when you have this group of coatis, we actually see that they split up by relatedness. So individuals that basically sharing family ties are more likely to split into the same subgroup. So this indicates that it's really something about sort of the social relationships that they're having with each other that's modulating the way that they split. We're now delving more into the dynamics of these splits to try and understand more about how and why they're splitting and what role the vocalizations are playing in mediating these splits and also the ways that they come back together. And speaking of coming back together, our last topic is about coming together to fight foes. And for this, I'm going to turn to the spotted hyenas. So spotted hyenas live in social groups of up to about 130 individuals. And unlike the meerkats and the coatis, they are very dispersed. So they mainly range alone or in small subgroups around quite a large territory. But they do come together for a variety of things, and one of them is to cooperate, specifically in the context of competing with lions. So I'm going to show you a video now. Can you hear it or no? Maybe I'll... So this is a lion-hyena conflict. So one of the things that's interesting about these types of conflicts is that if you're an individual hyena fighting an individual lion, you're not going to do very well because lions are much bigger and stronger than hyenas. However, hyenas live in these big clans, so they potentially have this numbers advantage over the lions. But there's a bit of a problem, which is that even though they have large clans, the mean clan size in the Mara, where we study the hyenas, is 47 individuals, they're very rarely all together. So most of the time, they're in a subgroup of 1 to 3 individuals, and that's not really enough to be able to fight, to take on these lions. So the way that they solve this problem is through communication, and they have these long-distance recruitment calls that are known as whoops, which I will play for you. So these calls can actually propagate over a couple of kilometers. And what we think might be going on in this process, and when hyenas give these calls, they recruit other members of the clan to join them. And so what we think might be going on at sort of a large scale here is that one individual might sense danger and start giving these whoop calls, and this information propagates to nearby individuals who then might also start giving those calls as well. And then potentially this could allow information to propagate over a much larger distance and recruit a larger group of hyenas to face the lions. And so in a way, the hyena clan could be kind of functioning as a dynamic and distributed sensory network where you have individuals that are sensing danger, and then this long distance communication and propagation of information allows them to converge on threats. But of course, this is something that's happening over, potentially, if it is happening, it's happening over a very large spatial scale, which is difficult to observe from on the ground. So this is where our tracking collars come in. So we also deployed these tracking collars on a full clan of hyenas, all the adult and subadult members, and these collars had similarly had GPS, audio, and a couple of other sensors. And this is some of the data that we got back. You can also see in this video, note the scale bar, which is 1 kilometer, so much larger than the other ones. And you can see the kind of fission-fusion dynamics. And when we look in this data, we're really just starting to dig into this data now, but I just want to show you one example of one of these long-distance recruitment events. So here I want you to watch the brown individual at the bottom. And so you can see suddenly everybody starts running towards that individual. I'll let it play again in case you missed it. So this is what we see from the GPS data, but if we actually look into the audio data, we can get an even better picture of what's going on in this event. So here is now the same individual, same event as before. The individual, the brown individual, is circled in that pink color. And when we look in the audio data, what we actually find is that that individual at this moment in time started giving whoop calls. And just to orient you here in this plot, the x-axis represents the time since the initial recruitment call, and the y-axis represents the distance from the initial recruiter, and each line represents a different hyena. And the pink circles represent whoop calls. So basically on this collar, we recorded this first individual giving whoop calls, and then as we go forward in time, we say it gave another series of whoop calls. And then at this moment in time, some other individuals started giving whoop calls as well, and at the same time, they started running towards the collar. And then eventually, you can see that a whole bunch of hyenas converged on this one spot. So this is, just a sort of an anecdotal example, but I think it illustrates how we can really see from this data that vocalizations can and do propagate through this dispersed group to facilitate convergence and cooperation. And so, of course, we are still investigating this data, and we hope to be able to do this in a more quantitative way soon. So moving forward, sort of even beyond this project, I'm really interested in, I think what we're really interested in understanding is, are there some common principles that underlie communication and coordination across different species, also including, of course, more species than we currently are investigating, and across different contexts of coordination? And also, what drives differences in the ways that communication and coordination systems have evolved across species? For example, how are they driven by different social and ecological constraints that different species face? And in order to do this, I want to highlight again something that has been mentioned throughout the conference, which is that this is something that really requires collaboration, and especially interdisciplinary collaboration. We have field biologists, engineers, computer scientists, people with expertise in machine learning, all coming together to tackle this question. And so on that note, I want to thank all of the collaborators that are involved in this study, as well as the long-term field studies that we work with. And I think since I'm the last person, I can also say on behalf of everyone that we are very thankful for the HFSP for funding this type of interdisciplinary and collaborative work. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions, and I'll use my power as chair. That's the first one. Maybe naively.
Can you use the mic? Can you use the mic?
Yes, sorry. I wonder, maybe a naive question, but do you have any idea how, in the case of the whoop calls, the individuals distinguish between the initial caller and the follow-up callers? Why don't they run around to anyone?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, we had sort of two ideas for how this might be happening. Either we have this sort of spatial propagation like you saw in the example, or you might have a case where they are calling and then they run to the caller and then they start calling there and kind of amplify the call at the original source. But yeah, I think that we don't know the answer to that yet. It's a really good question. I think one possibility is that because they keep giving these calls, they're sort of like funneling them in. So they sort of start going in a direction and then they hear that it's moving and then they eventually all end up at the spot. But I agree, this is something that would be really interesting to look at, and potentially also some modeling could be done there. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
All right, thanks, Paula, for asking my questions. I will ask a follow-up question. But beautiful talk, Ariana, and as I expected. So I was very surprised that you're not using any visual cues that the animals would have, and all of these is happening in the daylight. I could imagine that there's some ways of capturing that too, and that probably is how it's solving some of these other problems. So
yeah.
What's your thoughts on those?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they're definitely using vision. They're also, the other big one that we're missing is olfaction. But for vision, I think that we can have some sense, at least of kind of like, based on the spatial configuration, who can see each other and things like this. We also are trying in various ways in the different species to get some information about the habitat, which also would give information about the visibility. So for example, if there's like lots of vegetation versus if it's very barren. So yeah, I think that's certainly important and is something that I think we can get at in some ways, although not so much in like extreme detail with the current methods. Yeah, thanks.
All right, we have time for 2 more questions, but there will be a poster session afterwards, and Ariana will stick around there.
Okay, in this case, there appear to be just a subset of the animals joining in on the vocalizations. Yeah. I was curious about the meerkats. You suggested that once a move call was made, others might also contribute. Is that the case? Is it most of them once they decide to move, or still a subset?
Yeah, great question. So actually with the move calls, one thing I didn't mention is that there's known to be a kind of quorum response. So basically one individual will start giving move calls, and then if others respond, if they get up to sort of 3-ish individuals, that is known to drastically increase the probability that the group moves. That's for the case of like speeding up, which has been what it's mainly been looked at in. But yes, you definitely get sort of like this back and forth of calls, and that's something that we would like to investigate in the future, is like when you have, potentially you could also have like conflicts where everybody it wants to move, but they could be going in different directions. And so how those things are resolved is something that we also would be really interested in looking at. But yeah, I think in general, all these vocalizations, it's very complicated because it's not just like a single vocalization and then a single response. It's really like a whole sequence and sort of like a conversation of everything going on. So thanks a lot. Yeah.
Super interesting project. Thanks a lot for the interesting talk. I wonder if you plan to do playback experiments.
Yes. So we actually are doing playback experiments, at least in the meerkats and a little bit in the hyenas. And one of those playback experiments is actually about those move calls, because like I showed, when an individual is giving move calls and moving to the right, then it increases the probability that the group moves to the right. And so Lily Johnson-Ulrich, who's a postdoc with Marta Manzer in Zurich, has done an experiment of playing back move calls and also trying to differentiate whether it's really moving to the right or just being on the right of the group that is leading the group to turn right. So she's done an experiment where they play move calls and then either move to the right and end up on the outside, or start on the outside and move to the left and end up on the inside, and sort of trying to disentangle whether that call is saying, hey, come here, or whether it's saying move in this direction. So yeah, thanks.